Hello everybody and welcome to our first project for Compositing Fundamentals. This is going to be our basic comp, and I want to go over real quick what we're going to be doing in this particular assignment and the goals and the objectives and the outcomes. So this is what we're going to be doing, right? And we've broken it up into a few different areas. Now the purpose of this particular assignment is to teach you guys how to use Nuke. So it's an introduction into using Nuke and building a basic composite. So we're going to be taking render passes that we've rendered out of Maya. We're going to bring them and import them into Nuke and composite those rendered images into a live action background. And we'll also be adding in a sky, doing a bit of color correction for integration, adding in camera effects, basically building a simple basic composite, a typical type of composite that you would build and render out of Nuke. Okay, so this is to teach you guys, again, the basics of how to use Nuke and how we could build a composite. All right, so we'll just go through it here real quick. Now, before we begin, guys, please make sure if you go through FSO, I have it open here, let's see. All right, so if you go onto FSO on this particular assignment, all right, for the lecture component, make sure that you watch these videos first, the Nuke interface, importing your elements, constructing node networks, and working with transforms, all right? I want to make sure that you watch these videos before you start this lab assignment, okay? I'm going to assume that you have watched these videos, so some of this stuff I'm not going to cover. That being said, I will do a refresher real quick over the basics of the viewer and the navigation and whatnot inside of Nuke. All right, but again, make sure you watch those videos first before you start with this assignment. Okay, so that being said, we'll start with looking at our background. Now this background was actually, we shot this at Universal Studios. We are here in Orlando, so we were just out and about one day, and we were on the back lot, and we took a picture in a certain area at Universal. And then what we did was we basically, by the way, the sky was very overcast that day, so we decided that we were going to replace the sky. So again, part of the first thing that we're going to do in this assignment is we're going to build a sky, and we're going to composite it over our background. And then once we get into that, then we'll start dealing with our render passes out of Maya. Now you guys are familiar with render passes. You have learned about them in your shading and lighting and visual development classes. And here we're going to be talking about is how we can take our render passes and use them in the composite. The benefits to doing it and setting up your renders this way is ultimately about control. So we can really control and manipulate our image and to create our final result. And then finally we'll get into the finalizing, creating the final look of the image, creating the lens effects and whatnot, and then we'll go ahead and render it out at the bottom here. Okay, and this is going to be our basic comp. So let's just go ahead and get started here. I'm going to create a new comp. Let's go ahead and launch Nuke. Now I'm using the current version of Nuke, which is Nuke 11.1. You guys, as long as you're in Nuke 11 or Nuke 10 or Nuke 9, it should be fine. Those previous versions of Nuke, there shouldn't be any issues here. But before we get started, I do want to go over a few things on how we want to, again, set up our comp, set our project and whatnot, all right, because this stuff's important. And it's always good to do this when you're learning, right? So set this stuff up first, all right, and get in the habit of saving your scripts and doing all this stuff first before we begin. Okay, so that being said, let's go ahead and save our project, and we're going to save it in that folder that we created on our desktop here. So I'll go to my desktop, and there's our basic comp. Okay, and I'm going to save this, the naming convention that I have on FSO. All right, so you guys go ahead and save it. CFM-C for campus. Now, if you're online, that would just be a -O, and then the month, okay? And I will call this _V01. That just stands for version 01. And then we'll hit save. Okay, and you'll know that you've saved your project because up here at the top it'll say that it's been saved. Okay, so if you don't see this, or if it says untitled, or if it just says .nk, you haven't saved the script correctly. All right, so when you save it, and when I say script, I just mean the composite. make sure that when you save it, you have a path, okay? So it sees a path here that you're saving to, so it knows where to save the file. All right. Okay, so now that we have our script or our composite saved, now let's talk about the project settings, okay? If we go up to Edit, up at the top here, you can see that we can go to our project settings, okay? So let's just go ahead and select project settings. This is going to be the settings for our project. Now, the thing that I want you guys to pay attention to is this script directory button here. All right, we want to set this so when we import our assets, it makes the path relative. And I'll explain to you what that is here in just a moment. All right, so let's go ahead and set our script directory. Okay, so that just means now that this directory that our script or our comp is saved in, that's where it's essentially going to be our project, and that's where it's going to look for all the assets and elements that we use in our composite. All right. Frame range for this particular asset is just we're just dealing with the still frame, so we can do 1-to-1 frame range, and you'll notice the timeline will switch when we tab to the next one. Again, frames per second, 24 doesn't matter because you know, we're only going to render out one frame, so you can leave that where it is. Now the full size format for this particular assignment, we're going to do 1280 by 720. Okay, so 1280 by 720, that's going to be our resolution, and you can see that our viewer here kind of switched to that HD 720 preset. All right, proxy mode we're going to leave to scale. All right, and proxy scale is at 0.5. That just means if we ever need to down res the viewer, which proxy is right here, if we click it, you'll notice you see how it dropped the scale down by 50%. Okay, and a proxy is good for, you know, if we're just quickly setting up a comp and we just need to render quickly through the viewer, we can down res real quick so we can just render faster. All right, we're going to leave that where it's at. Okay, so now let's get into our preferences. Okay. Couple things that we typically have unchecked in our preferences or turned off in our preferences, and I just want to show you guys this so when you see it on off in our scripts, you guys don't get confused, because by default these things are on. So let's go all up to Nuke up here at the top, and then we'll go to our preferences. All right, and I want you guys to find your node graph. Okay, now you guys are going to notice that your expression arrows and your clone arrows are enabled. All right, and always by default these are on. Okay, we have these off. All right, and I'll tell you why when we get to using these. Okay, why we don't necessarily want these on. All right, but by default they're on for you. So if you want to turn them off, this is where you can turn them off. All right, so you don't see the expression or the clone arrows when we're doing these. All right, and let's just go ahead and hit OK. Oh, one more thing. Yeah, if I look at the preferences again, one thing you guys should know is that Nuke has a really good autosave feature, okay? So while you're away from your machine, it will save your project every 5 seconds, all right? You can see it force saves every 30 seconds while you're working, okay? So if Nuke does crash, you can get your comp back up and you haven't lost too much time, okay? So anyway, let's go ahead and close our preferences. We'll go back to those throughout the month, but for now I think we're done, and we can go ahead and close the properties, and I'll close my background renders here. All right, so this is my default layout, right, and this is the layout that we're going to use throughout our podcast. All right, you guys don't have to use this layout. You can see we have different types of workspaces or layouts. All right, so we can switch between the different ways we can work, okay? And you can move these panes around if you want. So if I'm in the comp and I don't want my viewer over here, I can move it over to the right. I can put my properties down here. I can put my node graph up here if I like. I can do whatever I want, you know, and set this up, and then of course you could save it if you wanted to. So you guys work to whatever's comfortable for you guys. Again, like I said, we'll leave it in this default layout, but sometimes I do switch my layouts from time to time depending on how I'm working. So okay, let's talk about how we want to import our assets into Nuke. All right, now you'll notice that there are a couple different ways we could do this. Okay, we could just drag and drop them in. All right, and that is one way to do it. So if you were to open up your Finder, go to your desktop. Let's see here. All right, so there's my basic comp. Right, let me just show you this. I could say grab my background and drag it in and do it like this, all right? There's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but you have to be careful, especially if you're dealing with an image sequence or something like that, that you import something correctly. So let me show you correct way to do it, or the way to do it the internal way within Nuke. So you're not dragging, from the Finder into Nuke or from an outside source into Nuke, but you're doing it within Nuke. Okay. So the way we import into Nuke is we use what are called read nodes. All right. Now, a read node is basically just a node that points to that particular file on your hard drive that you want to import into Nuke. All right. So the way we can create a read node, again, there's multiple ways we can create nodes. We can use our groups up here to the left, and you can see the very first node that we have is that particular read node. Okay, and that's one way we can create the node. I like to use quick keys though, so you can just hover over the node graph and hit R on the keyboard, and that will pull up a read file or a read node dialog box. Okay, and then we can navigate to where we have the files on our hard drive and import them in that way. So I can take that asset and import the background here. So I'm just going to import this one for now so you guys can see it. Okay, so here's my background. Okay, and you'll notice as I imported it in, the properties for this particular node popped up over here to the right. Okay, you can see it will tell me where it's located. All right, so there it is on my hard drive. And tell you the resolution of the file. All right, and if it was a frame or an image sequence, it would show you the frames here. Okay, now you notice I don't see it in the viewer. All right, and that's because it needs to be plugged into the viewer node that we have down here, the node graph. Remember, the viewer node is that one node that Nuke creates for you. So if I grab the input pipe to the viewer and plug it into this background input, now we can see it in our viewer up here at the top. All right. Now there's a quick key to load images into the viewer. All right. We don't have to grab this pipe every time and drag it in. We can highlight a node and hit 1 on the keyboard, the numeric key 1, and that can load it in. Okay. And you can do 1 through 9. So you can have multiple inputs on a viewer. Typically, I don't use more than 2 or 3, but you can load more if you need to. All right, let's just go ahead and import the rest of these assets here. So I'm just going to go ahead and read in the rest of these, right, that we have for this assignment. So we'll just load them up here. All right, and you can see how I just kind of all brought them in. It kind of all stacked them on top of each other. Well, what we can do is just left drag select to highlight all of them and hit L on the keyboard, and that just lays them out. So let's start looking and see what we have, and we can start organizing this stuff on how we want to put it together. So here's our background. I'm going to go ahead and put this off over here. All right. We have our clouds. Let's move our clouds over here. All right. So here are our occlusion of the car, which is basically the contact shadow underneath the car. And here's our shadow. Okay, so let's move both these. Set these over here. And we can have our car render passes. All right, so here's our beauty pass. We're not going to use this, but this will be our reference. All right, you can see we have our indirect pass, our occlusion. These are going to be the first 2 car passes we'll use. So we'll kind of set these kind of together. Our ID we'll kind of put over here to the left. Class and diffuse, that will come. Okay, so we've just got to sort of put our nodes kind of in these areas of how we're going to work. All right, and now we just need to start to kind of build our workflow and how we want to work. Now, typically the way I like to work is I kind of start from the furthest, or the sky or the background, and kind of work towards the foreground. All right, so the first thing we want to do is start to build our sky. So let's go ahead and start to do that here. All right. So we want to start with our clouds here, and you'll notice the resolution of our clouds. All right, it's different than the resolution of our project. Now we're going to start with creating a constant or a solid color that will be our initial color for the sky. So we can do a sky blue. So to create a solid color inside of Nuke, we create what's called a constant node. So again, there's numerous ways to create nodes. The most common way we're going to use or create nodes is using the tab key. And this is similar to using the hypershade in Maya. So you hit tab and you tab in the name of the node you want. In this case, I'm typing in constant, and there's my constant, okay? Now, if I load it in the viewer, hit 1 on the keyboard, you'll notice it's black, right? Because the constant node defaults to being a black color. But we can start to adding color by clicking on this little color wheel. Now, if you just click on the color wheel, you're going to get the internal color wheel inside the node, okay? And that's fine. This does have its uses, but there is a better color wheel in my opinion, and that's by holding down Command and clicking on it. If you hold down Command and click on the color wheel, to me, this is a much better color wheel. I can kind of move it around, and I have different options on how I can color or create the color that I want. All right, so I'm just going to start to add in some blue here. We can even use one of these presets to give us something that starts to look like a sky blue, maybe something like that. Okay, and it might be a little bit too saturated, but again, we can come back to this and adjust it as we need to. All right, but right now, what I want to do is just go ahead and give it a slight gradation. All right, you guys notice that skies are never uniform, right? There's always a little bit amount of gradation, and they tend to get lighter as I get towards that horizon line. So if I want to create a gradient in Nuke, it's called a ramp, all right? And we're going to use ramps a couple different ways in this assignment, all right? For this particular instance, we're going to just put it on the background or connect it to our constant to create this sense of it getting lighter as it gets towards the bottom. And again, we'll probably have to adjust this once we start comping it in, but let's just initially get it put in there, and then like I said, we can come back to it and comp it later. So I'm just going to tab in, tab in a ramp, all right? And as long as you have the constant node highlighted, it will go ahead and connect it up for you. Okay, so if you notice, we have a P1 and a P0 on the ramp, and we're just going to rotate these around. So the P1 is at the bottom, and then the P0 is at the top. And again, if it's too much, right, we can come back and adjust these. Maybe this is a little too, or we want to bring it down, all right? But we'll come back to it and get to it if we need to, all right? But that's starting to look pretty good. Keep in mind that the resolution, again, is 1280 by 720, and then we've got our clouds that are at 1280 by 1024, all right? Now, this shouldn't be a big deal because we're going to put our clouds over our background sky here, okay? But we do need to pay attention to resolutions when we start dealing with our background in our car, because you'll notice our background resolution is at 1920 by 1080, and our car is going to be at 1280 by 720. So we will need to account for this when we get to the background here in just a moment, all right? But for now, let's just go ahead and keep dealing with the sky, okay? So we have our clouds, all right? And you'll notice that our clouds have a white background. Go ahead and close our ramp here, just get that off the screen, all right? So a white background, okay? So you'll notice that we can look at the red channel in the image, we can look at the green channel of the image, and we can look at the blue channel of the image, and then we can look at the alpha channel. And you can see that our clouds do have an alpha. So why aren't we seeing the transparency in the color? Why is this still all white when this should be all black? Well, the reason why is because this image has not been pre-multiplied. And basically what that means is that these values that are in the color channels have not been multiplied by these values that are in the alpha. Okay, so as soon as I take a pre-mult node and multiply, again, these values that we see here, or these values that we see here, and multiply them by the values that we see here, all right, which would be down here, if I sample these values here, then we'll get our transparency in the color, okay? So as soon as you, underneath the clouds, create what's called a pre-mult node, right? Now you'll notice that we're seeing that transparency, okay? And you guys, when you're rendering out of Maya, you'll notice when you render, you'll see that pre-multiply, it's usually checked on. That means when you render out of Maya, it's giving you a pre-multiplied image, okay? That's just usually when you're just rendering like a beauty pass, something you probably would have been doing in shading and lighting. It's different when you're doing render passes, but like a beauty pass, typically it'll give you a pre-multiplied image, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and merge or put these over our sky, all right? And the way we do that is we use what's called a merge node. A merge node is probably the most common node that you're going to use inside of Nuke, all right? It's how we put everything together, right? A compositor needs to put multiple elements or assets together from all different types of departments, and the merge node is how we do it. So if I hit M on the keyboard, that's its quick key, that will create a merge. And if we look at a merge, you can see a merge has multiple inputs, an output pipe, and then a mask input pipe. And the mask input pipe is to mask essentially A, which we'll use here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and merge this pre-multiplied clouds over our background here and see what we get. So I want my clouds to be on top of the sky, so I want my clouds on A, and I want my sky on B, just like that. Okay, so I'm going to pull out the little elbows here, these little yellow dots, hold down Command, and you can kind of line this up so it looks a little nicer here. All right, and let's go ahead and load this merge in the viewer and see what we're getting. All right, so there are our clouds. Of course, they're really low in the sky. We want them much higher up. Okay, but you can't just grab them in the viewer and kind of move them up. That's not going to work. We're going to need to create basically a transform node to transform them or move them up into the sky. So after our pre-mult, let's use our groups. Let's go over here to the groups and let's find our transform group, which is this one here, and let's create a transform node. Okay, so there's our transformation. All right, and let's go ahead and just grab transformation controls and move those clouds up. Maybe something like that. All right, now it's not looking bad. It's okay for now. These clouds, though, look a little odd, and I want them to kind of blend off into the horizon line, right? So I don't want to see them as much as they go off towards our horizon line. So basically what I'm going to do is create another ramp and use that ramp as a mask for this A input on our merge node. Okay, so watch what we do here. What we're going to do is, again, command or click off so nothing's highlighted. Let's tab in a ramp. All right, and with this ramp, we want to use it a little bit differently than how we used before. Okay, since we're going to use it as a mask input, the way a mask input works is basically whatever's white you're going to see and whatever's black you're not going to see. So if I want it to kind of fade off, right, I want to set the ramp to look something like this. Okay, so again, up at the top of the clouds, this is where we'll see the clouds, and then as we go here and it slowly starts to get to black, we're going to see less and less of the clouds. And again, we can tweak this, and not only that, we can change the slope or the decay of this ramp here in just a moment. But let's go ahead and plug it up, and you guys can see what happens when we do that. Okay, so again, plug the ramp in. All right, and you can notice, see how it's starting to fade these out. As I increase this up, it's just kind of pushing those away into the horizon. Now that might be a little too much. I can come back a little bit. And not only that, we can tweak, again, the quality of this type of ramp. So if I look at this ramp, you can see this is a linear type of decay, but we can switch it to something more like this. And you can tweak, go through these and just look and see the ones that might give you the result you're looking for to create that type of fall off that you want. All right. So, okay, not bad for now. Again, we can come back and tweak this. One of the things I'm going to want to do is go ahead and crop. Whenever you have data, this is part of the clouds that are going beyond the viewer. Nuke is still going to process all this data. Okay, so it's a good idea if you're not going to use it, you know you're not going to use it, just crop it out. Essentially cut it out and get rid of it so Nuke doesn't process it. So underneath this guy, this merge node, I'm going to tab in what's called a crop, and it will automatically just crop to our resolution. Okay, now if you're getting that little 1 pixel larger, just turn off black outside in the crop node, and that should fix that. Okay, let's go ahead and close that ramp. Okay, so there's our sky. Again, we can tweak this a little bit. Maybe I want to move these up. So I'm just going to middle mouse scroll wheel this up. Something like that. Okay. And that's not looking too bad. So let's go ahead and organize this by using a backdrop node. And we'll call this sky. Okay, so it's a good idea to stay organized in your scripts when you're working. So once you get a little area, in this case, here's a little sky that we just created. Let's tab in what's called a backdrop. All right, and in the backdrop node, just double click it, and we can name this sky. And you can give it a color if you want. If you don't like the color that it assigns to it, just make it whatever color you want. All right, maybe something like that. Because it's the sky, make it kind of a bluish color. I don't really like them too saturated, but everyone has their tastes, right? You can color them however you want. All right, so there's our sky. So now what we need to do is we need to get our, again, background here over our sky that we just did. Now, we have a similar issue with the background that we had with the clouds, is that the fact that we have the color channels here, red, green, and blue, but we do not see the transparency that we have in the alpha. And again, it's because we do not, or this image has not been pre-multiplied yet. So simple fix is we take our background and we pre-mult. All right, and now you can see we've got our transparency. All right, but here's the issue with our background. Again, it is at an different resolution than our sky, right? Our sky is at 1280 by 720, and our background is at 1920 by 1080. And this is because Nuke can run at resolution independency, right? Meaning that you can have different elements at different resolutions in the same project, okay? But when you start to do the merges are always going to use the B input to dictate the output of the resolution. And yes, there are some of these things that we can adjust in the merge node, but it's a good idea that when we're doing this stuff, in order so that everything lines up correctly, we get everything in the right resolution and get everything fit. So in this case, what we're going to do with the background is we're going to knock it down. So even though it's at 1920 by 1080, we're going to reformat this. So we're going to reformat it using a reformat node, and I'm going to reformat it to 1280 by 720. Now, as long as you set the project to 1280 by 720, it will go ahead and reformat it to that resolution. Okay, so again, here is 1920 by 1080, and then we just reformatted it down to 1280 by 720. So now, when I do the merge here, everything will line up. So let's go ahead and create a merge. M on the keyboard. And then I will load this into the viewer here like that, and then load this here. And let's go ahead and see how it looks. All right. So immediately, yes, the background, sky, way too saturated, right? Way too blue here. So we could probably fix this with the ramp. So I'm going to come back with this ramp. Maybe push this up a little bit. You could go to the original constant and adjust the blue, but I think I can get what I want just by kind of moving the ramp and tweaking it. Also, you'll notice my clouds are way too low, so they will need to come up. But I also want you guys to notice something else about the clouds, right, as opposed to our background that we're using here. Okay, so if we look at the clouds, look at the lighting, right? We've got the lighting kind of hitting off to the left, right, creating the shadows on the right here. But our background, obviously, we've got the right lighting in the other direction, coming off from the right. The shadows are casting to the left. So we need to flip these clouds, right? We need to match the lighting. So in these clouds, all right, the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to pre-molt, and then I'm going to create another reformat. And this reformat isn't going to reformat it to that 1280 resolution. I don't need it to do that. In fact, I can keep it at its original resolution. All I need to do is flop the image. And flopping the image will essentially switch it or flip it around so now it's facing the right direction. And now they look like they will match in the background plate. Okay, so if I disable this, just hit D to disable a node. You can see that's what we just did. We just flopped or flipped those clouds around so the lighting direction matches. All right. Great. So there's our background. And we've got our clouds kind of merged in to that background. Now, one of the things we could do is we could try to tweak or color correct these clouds using some of the background sky color. You'll notice in these areas here, it's getting a little kind of dark and kind of grayish looking. So if I want these to kind of feel more like the background color, let's go ahead and do some color correction on this. So I'm actually going to color correct before I pre-molt. Okay, so I'm going to create what's called a grade node. And a grade node, a very common color correction node that we use. We'll use it a lot. I like to use it a lot. You can do a lot with the grade node, and we'll use it a lot throughout the month. So it is a color correction node. So if you guys come up to the groups, you guys want to use your groups, you can find it here. There's the grade node. Of course, it does have its quick key, G, which we'll use a lot. But what I want to do is I want to basically use the lift, okay? And once again, as we go through our assignments, like I said, we'll go into a little bit more detail about what all these do and how you use these. For now, basically, I just want to lift up, or I want to fill that bluish color that we have here into the lift of the clouds here, okay? Keep in mind, I'm only affecting the color channels. I do not want to affect RGBA because I don't want to affect the alpha here. So just the color, and I'm doing it before we do our premultiplication. Okay, so what I just did is I basically just sampled this blue. So I held down Shift Command and sampled a range of values, which gave me a little swatch down here. Okay, and then what I'm going to do with the swatch is drag it into the lift of that grade node. Now you'll notice it started to kind of tweak our clouds out and immediately integrated them better into that background. All right, now it might be a little bit too strong here, but you'll notice in the grade node we have a mix slider and we can mix in what we just did. So if it's too much, you see how I can just kind of control it or mix it into my taste. And I'm going to go maybe about to about 0.6, 0.7, somewhere around there. Right, and just to kind of mix that in and make that look like it's sitting a little bit more better in the background there. All right, that's looking good. To get the little sampler off, just hold down Command and click somewhere off the viewer. So let's click somewhere there. Okay. So there is our sky. Oh, let's move this so we can kind of see it. And then we've got our background merged over. All right, so this is where we're at so far. Let's look and see what the alpha channel looks like. If I look at the alpha, let's see what we're getting here. All right, it's giving us something that looks like this. And basically what it's doing is it's just merging both alpha channels from A and B and putting them together. But I don't necessarily want the alpha that's coming from B in this case, which is my background, right? So if I look at this guy, my crop, here's my background, and I hit A on the keyboard to look at the alpha, that's my alpha channel, right? And that's not necessarily what I want, okay? So I'm going to, in the merge, you'll notice you have all these options on what you want to merge. So in this case, the B input, which is my sky, I'm going to say, do not merge that alpha, okay? So the A, which is the one I want, this one is going to come through the merge, okay? So now if I look at the composite, again, there's my background with my sky, but if I hit A on the keyboard to look at the alpha, there's the alpha right there, okay, that I want. All right, and the reason why I want it like that is because of the next step, what I'm going to do. All right, we want to integrate or start to integrate our background and our sky together. And one of the things that we're going to want to do is add something called light wrap. Now, if you guys don't know what light wrap is, or if you've never heard the term light wrap, actually, you know what? Let's use our book. I have my book open right here, right? This is the book that we use in the class, The Art and Science of Digital Compositing. So if you ever come across anything that we're talking about in lecture or in one of our podcasts, it usually correlates to a chapter in the book. All right. So if, for example, I search for light wrap, let's see what it pulls up. Okay. Additional integration techniques. Okay. So we can go here and we can start to look and see what they start to talk about once we get to light wrap. So let's see, light wrapping here. All right. Okay, so basically what they're talking about with light wrapping is that when we have these areas here, where you have brightness and then you have a darkness kind of, or dark edge, or bright behind something that's kind of dark, you're going to have these bright values kind of bleed over into these edges, all right, or kind of like come over these edges. And it's just to integrate it better into the environment, to make it feel like it's sitting in that sky here, all right? And the way we do it is we use the sky with the alpha from our, in this case, background, okay? So watch what we're going to do here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a dot here before it gets merged over. So the sky is going to get its own little dot here. Again, I held down Command to create that dot. Now I'm going to tab in a light wrap node. So let's tab in a light wrap. All right. Plug the B input, all right, this guy, into the original plate. So you can see this is passing through the original plate. And then the A is going to come up here. And yes, we do have to cross these over. As much as I hate crossing these pipes, sometimes you just have to do it. All right. So anyway, Okay, so let's look at the light wrap and see what's going on here, all right? Well, the first thing I want to do is, you'll notice, well, it doesn't seem like it's really doing much. Let's turn on generate wrap only, okay? And you'll notice you don't see anything just yet, all right? And there we go. Turn these intensities up. Okay, now the reason why is because these inputs needed to be flipped, all right? And that's good that I did it like that so you guys can see how you can flip inputs, all right? So I set up the inputs where I had this one on B and then I had the sky on A. And in reality, I needed to have them the other way around. I needed to have the sky on B and then the background on A. So again, this happens all the time. An easy way to flip inputs is to hold down Shift and hit X. Okay, as soon as you hit Shift and X, you see how they flipped? All right, and now I have my background on A, I have my sky on B, and in the light wrap's properties, I turned on generate wrap only. So you can see what it's doing. It's taking that alpha from our background and it's kind of using the background to kind of wrap around those areas of the edges of the background. Okay, so what we're going to do with this is then composite it back over the original background. Now, the intensity, again, we can adjust this how we want. The diffuse might be a little too much, right? So we can bring this down if we want. And this is a very, very subtle thing, right? But it's just to integrate into the shot. Okay, so here is our plate before the light wrap. So I'm going to hit M, create another merge. All right, I'm going to take our light wrap, put it on A. All right, and for this particular operation on the merge, I'm not going to leave it set to over, but I'm going to switch it to a plus. All right, your operations in the merge are basically like your blending modes in Photoshop if you guys came from Photoshop, all right? So it's how A interacts with B, right? Now, if you guys ever want to know what the math is happening, you can just always hover over these merge nodes or any node, and Nuke's pretty well with their documentation and their hints and their little tool tips and whatnot, and you can see what's happening here. So with plus, it's just literally A plus B. Since this is lighting, this is how we want to deal with this. We want this to be A plus B, okay? Now, we can do, let's see here. Let's see, disable luminance. See, I'm just seeing if I could tweak a few of these settings first. Okay. All right, so let's plus it over and see. Now again, way too intense here, right? But what we want to do on the mix of the merge is mix in A to taste. So we drop this down all the way, right? The mix on the merge. And then you drop it and you start to dial it up. And like I said, you're trying to create that look like the light just wrapping around the objects here. So again, very subtle what we're doing. But this is compositing is all about the subtleties, okay? So again, very subtle. You can notice it hitting just the very top of the buildings here. And maybe you don't see it, but if I show you the original, right, there's the original, and there it is with it, okay? So again, without it, and then with it. Without it, and then with it. Right? And if that's too extreme, right, I think my diffuse, it might be a little too sharp. So I might want to up my diffuse just a little bit so I get a little bit more of a bloom effect happening. There we go. And again, I can either mess with the intensity or adjust the mix, right, on the merge node, right, just to integrate it in just a little bit better. That's looking better, right? So there's before and there's with it in, okay? All right. So we've got our background, right? Looks good. One thing I'm going to want to do with this guy is, since this is an image, it does have some noise in it. All right, so I do want to denoise this image because we're going to add the noise back in at the bottom. All right, we're going to add noise in. You can see the noise here. So what I'll do is at the very top of this node, I'm going to tab in a denoise. All right. With the denoise, you want to sample somewhere in the image that'll give you a good noise pattern, but doesn't really show a lot of detail in the image. Okay. If you select something with a lot of detail, it's going to blur the image a little too much, and even then, this looks maybe a little too blurry. So in the denoise, you might want to the denoise amount or the smoothness you might want to drop down. Maybe like that. Keep in mind that denoise can be pretty render intensive or expensive. You can see just how long it took to process. If you ever see the node and you see the little yellow box go around the node, that means the node is processing or it's calculating. So that's what that means. All right, so anyway, we have it denoised. Like I said, we're doing this because we're going to, again, incorporate the computer generated imagery into the shot, and then towards the bottom of the composite, add in the noise over everything essentially. So the car, the background, and the sky, right? When we start doing our camera and our lens effects. Okay, so let's just go ahead and organize this. So I will create another backdrop node. Try to stay organized in your comps. It's always a good idea because eventually someone else is going to take your comp at your job, right? So it's going to leave your hands and someone else is going to have to deal with it eventually. So make sure, or background, um, make sure you stay neat and organized for people, all right? That'll eventually get it and it'll help everyone out. So I'm going to do something like this. This is the, I just want it to look all nice and centered, so I have to do it. Take the time to kind of center it out. Okay. So just to, yeah, go back over. We did our sky. We did our background. We merged our background over. We've got our light wrap that we just generated. And now we've got our sky done. Now we can focus on getting our car in there. Let's go ahead and close the properties and talk about the car. Okay, so let's take a look at these passes here and see just in a little bit more detail what we're working with here. All right. So if you have the car beauty pass, we're not going to be using this one. We might use it for the alpha, but typically if you get a beauty, it's for reference. It's how you want, or just to give you like an idea of what you're going for in the composite. But a beauty is going to be very limited as as far as what you can do and how you can control it. Okay, so um, we're going to set the beauty off to the left here. All right, and let's look at, we have our indirect pass, and we have our occlusion pass, which they go together. Okay, so the shadows of the occlusion and the indirect, we're going to multiply this over this, right? And then once we have that, then we will take our diffuse, which is our direct lighting, and plus that in. Okay, so I always have students ask me, they're a little unclear, they're unsure, they don't really understand where they start with their render passes, what they need to render out, and where do they start. What is the, the one that I start with? Well, you have to remember what these passes signify. What are they about, right? This is just specific data that you're telling the renderer to render out. And most of the time, it's your lighting. So in this case, in shading and lighting, you guys learned about the two different types of light, right? We have indirect and direct lighting, right? So this is my indirect diffuse and my direct diffuse, okay? Lighting here. Now, the ambient occlusion, right, is just the shadow areas, right, of the ambient light being blocked. So we're going to take this and combine it with this. And the particular operation that we use on the merge is a multiply. Okay, so if we think of a multiplier, what a multiply is doing, all right, this is very basic math. All right, so look at an occlusion pass. An occlusion pass is always going to look like this, right? It's just black and white or grayscale information. Well, if I sample this value up here, for example, you'll notice that it is 1. Okay, so if you multiply a value by 1, all right, you guys will know that that value stays the same. So 5 times 1 is 5. All right, 5,000 times 1 is 5,000, right? So basically it makes white transparent when you use the multiply operation because everything just stays the same. So this essentially disappears, all right? All you're left with is these values that are non-1, right? Because if you start to multiply these values, right, then you start to get shading, okay? So if I take this occlusion, all right, and I multiply them over the indirect, let's go ahead and set that up here. So we'll create a merge, and I'll take my indirect and put it on B, and I'll put my occlusion on A. And this will be the first step, right? We're starting with our lighting, the indirect lighting portion of the car. Okay, and I'll hold down Command to get the little elbow to pull out the dot. All right, and here is our very first composite. All right, now if I look at this, hit F to kind of focus on it. Again, we're just seeing the occlusion over our diffuse or our indirect diffuse here. Okay, so again, it's in the operation. As soon as I set this to multiply, everything that's white now becomes transparent, and we're just left with the shadow information from our occlusion. Again, if I use the mix on the merge, I can mix in the amount of occlusion I want on my car. All right, so 100% is always too much to me. It starts to look like dirt or like chimney soot, right? So we don't want 100%. We just want to mix it in to plus the shadows on our indirect pass. Okay, so now let's look at our diffuse, right? Now we're going to take our diffuse and we're going to add or plus this in to our car, which is essentially our occlusion multiplied over our indirect. So now we take our diffuse and plus it over our indirect. So this is our direct diffuse. I should call it direct diffuse and indirect diffuse. Okay, there we go. So again, and we can mix this into taste. So you can mix in your direct lighting. So that's completely indirect lighting, and you mix in your direct lighting, which is the sun, of course, right? And again, we'll come back to these and adjust them as we need to. Okay. So at this point, we need to talk about again that alpha channel and that pre-multiply issue here. So if I look at our car and hit A on the keyboard, you can see it has an alpha channel. But since we're rendering with render passes, we still need to make sure that this is pre-multiplied. And it's primarily for our transparency, so that we see the transparency correctly in the car. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do the pre-mult here. And the reason why I'm going to go ahead and do it here is because the rest of these passes are just plussed over. And if you look at a plus operation, you'll notice there plus it's just a plus b. It doesn't take into account any alpha, as opposed looking at over. And over says a plus b, but then in parentheses it has that 1 minus little a. That little a is the alpha, right? All right, so it's taking the inverse of the alpha and cutting it out of b. That's what the overage doing. So a plus is just basically a plus b. It's not dealing with alpha information. So here I could go ahead and do the premul. All right. Now, there's different ways you could do this and set this up, and there's different places you could put the pre-mult, and there's not going to be, well, there could be a wrong way you could do it, but there's multiple right ways to do this. Again, I'm putting it here because of the nature of how I'm going to do the rest of these passes, since they're just getting plussed over. All right. So that being said, let's look and see what we got. We have our reflection. Sometimes a reflection can be called an indirect spec. All right, because a specular pass is essentially just a reflection of our light source. Okay, so a reflection can sometimes be called, like I said, an indirect specular pass. Anyway, okay, so we have our reflection, we have our glass, which is essentially almost like our refraction pass. Okay, so we can go ahead and add this in, and this is going to be plussed in. We'll take this guy. Whoops. Make sure you load it in the right node. All right. And then I'll take my reflections, go ahead and plus those in. All right. And then finally, we'll take our spec, and our spec will get plugged in. All right. Ooh, a little too bright. Let me go ahead and knock that one down. It's going to be a little bit too much for me. Okay, and of course, if I wanted to, let's say, tint the glass or adjust the reflections, maybe they're too strong, we could do that again in the mix if we wanted to, okay? But we've initially just got the car composite set up. There it is. Let's see, we do have our beauty, and then we have our ID mats, which we'll talk about here in a moment. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our composite and see what it looks like. So here's our background, and here's our car. So I'll just drag select, tab in a backdrop. Let's go ahead and do this. Get this guy kind of situated over here. And do our merge. Now I will leave this as an over. This is not a plus because I do want it to take into account that alpha of the car that we pre-multiplied. So that way we see the composite correctly, okay? So there is our car over the background, and it looks quite odd. And the reason why is because there's no shadows, right? So we don't have the contact shadow or the occlusion shadow underneath, and we don't have the casting shadow of the car off to the left either. Okay, so again, we need to adjust those. So that's why we have these two passes here, the ground occlusion and then the car shadow, okay? So this occlusion, we're going to use it a little bit differently because there are multiple ways to use occlusion. Where I showed you how to use it as a multiply over here, so again, over here we kind of multiplied it over our indirect. All right, here I'm going to use it as a mask input, okay? So a mask input just isolates an area of a color correction operator, okay? So let's look at our ground here, and then here's where we do the light wrap. So I want to put the shadows here, okay? So let's drag this merge down, and I'm going to create a grade node. So hit G on the keyboard to create a grade, and let's plug it here on the background, and then load it in the viewer. Okay, so if I grab, all right, let's say, for example, the gain in the grade node and just drag it down, you'll see the entire image gets darker, okay? But what we're going to do is isolate it using the mask input so it only affects this area that we see here. But in order for us to do this, or for it to work correctly, we need to know how a mask works, all right? So a mask works kind of like the opposite of how we were doing it when we were using it with the multiply. So the areas of white is the areas that the mask is going to work, and the areas that are black are the areas where the mask is not going to work. So if I were to, for example, let's say plug this into the mask input, all right, and then let's say for the mask input, let's use, it doesn't matter what channel, this is just a black and white image, so I could say use the red channel as the mask input. Now if I load this in and grab the gain down, you'll see what it does, right? So it does the opposite of what I want it to do. So that's okay, right? There's a million ways to get around this, okay? We could just invert this node. So I could tab in and invert underneath it and invert it, and then we've got our contact shadow working correctly. All right, that's one way to do it. Okay, we could just do that in the mask input. So you don't need to create that invert node because the mask input says invert right here. You can check it on, and now you can see we can get our occlusion into the shot. So look at areas here, like in the image, to kind of gauge how dark this needs to be. It's not going to be quite 100%. But it'll be close, okay, to knocking it all the way down. And you might be, well, that looks weird, right? Look at it with the car on top if you want to kind of see how it's sitting in. All right. Got an issue. Oh, look at that. That's cool. We'll come back to that. There is an issue going on with my alpha, so I'll show you why that's happening here in just a second. All right. So anyway, there's our occlusion. Now let's go ahead and get our casting shadow. Okay, that's the shadow being casted from the car. Again, this is happening because of the indirect lighting being blocked, but then we've got the shadow being cast from the direct light. So you can see we have live action shadows here in the plate, and this is what we're going to try to match. So if you notice the car shadow, you load it in the viewer, you're going to say, well, wait, it's empty. There's nothing in it. In reality, the matte is for the shadow is in the alpha channel. So if you look at the alpha channel, there it is right there, right? So A on the keyboard, you can just look at the alpha. So we're going to create another grade node. So G on the keyboard, create another one, plug the mask input into the shadow, but make sure on the mask input that you select alpha channel, right? Because you want to use the alpha channel from this guy as your input for the mask. So now we can look here. There we go, that's what I want. All right, look here, and we can drop our gain down to get something like this. And again, use these values here to gauge what you're going to see here. Because that's essentially that part of that part of the casting shadow you're going to see. So you could go into the color wheel and start to add in, try to use your eyes to try to find that color. And again, you can use your values to lighten up, maybe remove a little bit of the saturation, and maybe bring it down a little bit. Maybe add a little bit more saturation in. All right, and just keep tweaking it. Like I said, use your eyes and try to get it as close as you can to what you're seeing over here to the right, okay? And I can keep going here just maybe a little bit. All right, so let's address what's happening with this alpha, okay? So if you notice, when I looked at my car, all right, I'm like, oh, my car composite looks okay, but I hit A on the keyboard and all this transparency data has been affected. Now, where did this happen and how did this happen? Okay, so this is common that stuff like this happens that you're not expecting, like a problem, right? So as I was going through this tutorial, I didn't expect this to happen, but it's okay because part of what we do is troubleshooting and problem solving. So here is how you problem solve, right? You just work your way back up through the script and you find where it went wrong. So in this case, where did I screw up the alpha? Where did I fill in these areas with gray? So I'm just going to go back up the composite. So I just hit A on the keyboard to look at the alpha. And I'll go this way. Oh, there it was right there. So it was in the spec right there is what's causing that issue. So if I look at the spec pass and I hit A on the keyboard, look at that. It's because it has a completely opaque alpha channel. All right, so if you guys remember what we did up here, right, where I just said I turned off one of the alpha channels, right, we're going to do the same here on this merge. But remember, this is on the A input. So on this merge, the A input, I'm going to say don't merge that completely opaque alpha. Okay, so now when I do this, okay, and I look at my alpha, I don't have all that garbage essentially or values in this area here. Okay, all right, there we go. Okay, let's see here. Yeah, let's just go through this. Bring that in. Right. That's what was doing it. Okay, so again, with the mix on the diffuse, right, it was the mixing in, right, and it was mixing our alpha as well. So one of the things that if you wanted it to pass through, you could uncheck it, or we could copy the alpha down here at the bottom and do it that way. But leaving the mix at 1, and there we go. Now we're seeing something that looks a little bit better. Okay, so there's our car. Now let's talk about what we can do to further get this to look a little bit better in the shot. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and color correct my car. And basically what I was showing you guys just with the merge and when we were having to deal with this alpha, that brings up a point to when we start to color correct. Let me show you something. If I create a grade node underneath the car here, and I want to start to color it to kind of match our background a little bit better, look what happens when I grab the lift. So if I grab the lift and start to, crank it up, you notice what's happening. This transparency is getting affected, okay? Even though it says we're only affecting the RGB, you got to remember what we did up here with this pre-molt. We basically embedded the transparency data into our color, okay? So if I affect the color, I affect the transparency. So Nuke knows this. Nuke understands that sometimes you need to do or put a node after something's been pre-multiplied. So you'll notice that these color correction nodes always have this unpremult by. Okay, so you can unpremult by the alpha. Basically what that means is that Nuke will unpremult the node, let you do the color correction, and then as it outputs, it remultiplies it for you. So now if you notice, if I grab the lift, see how only the car gets affected, but nothing or none of the transparency gets affected? Okay, so just make sure whenever you do this, if you have to do this before premult, right, that you unpremult by the alpha. Okay. So I'm going to use the lift and the gain to match the black and the white points of the background to help the car better sit in the composite. Okay, so with the grade node selected, all right, I'm going to select the eyedropper for the lift, and this will be the black point or the darkest spot in the background. So as soon as I click this and I hold down Command, because Command will sample. See how you sample and you just drag around? See what it's doing to the car? It's essentially setting the black point of the car. So I'm going to move it to somewhere over where I feel is probably the darkest spot in the image. So probably somewhere in here, or maybe somewhere back in here. So we'll say here, okay? All right, so that is my sample for the black point of the car, right? Which is now matched to the background. So now what I'm going to do is set the white point of the car to the white point of the background. Again, we're going to do this with the gain. So I'll select the eyedropper for the gain. Hold down Command and watch again as I drag around. See what it's doing to the car? So find a good white point, right, that you feel helps sit the car in the shot, right? Now, even if it doesn't look bright enough yet, it's all right. I'm going to say maybe somewhere up here, maybe over here, right? Or maybe this area here. It's what you think should be white in the background. I'll say right there, okay? Now you have the multiply, offset, and gamma for the further kind of refinement of the car here. So again, if the car is looking a little too dark, right, we can brighten it up with the multiply, okay? And if it looks a little too washed out, all right, you could always decrease the gamma and add a little bit more contrast to it. An offset essentially is just going to lift or add everything. So you'll notice it will give you this, it will start to give you this type of milky look as you add that up, right? But again, these are supposed to be very subtle movements here that we just make subtle adjustments to really get the car to sit the way we want in the composite. And the spec pass, I'm going to knock down just a little bit. Something like that. Okay. Another thing that you can always do with CG to help it sit in something that's live action is drop the saturation. So if I tab in a saturation node, again, I want to make sure I unpromote by the alpha, but I'm just going to drop this down to maybe like 0.7. And since the car is already a little bit gray, we're starting to get a little gray there, maybe 0.8. But just dropping just the slightest bit of saturation can help sit it into a background plate, okay? So if I disable these, again, you'll see there's the before and there's the after. And you'll see, yes, it's subtle, right? But compositing is all about the subtleties and just adding in these subtle changes like we did with the light wrap and the color correction to make everything sit or feel like it's in the shot. Okay. So let's talk about what we can do with these IDs. So you'll notice that we do have this identification mask here. All right, and basically we can use these to color correct the car. So for example, if you wanted to use the red channel to change the color of the car, right, you could use the red channel as a mask to color correct essentially the color of the car. So you could do that. You could do that up here if you wanted to. So let's say let's go here. After you've put your basically your color, let's do a grade node. All right, and plug the mask input of the grade node into this ID. All right. Now what we could do here is you could say, okay, if you remember that the body of the car is on the red channel, so you'll use that as the mask. And then we could go into the gain here and start giving it some color, right? If you wanted to give your car body more of a color, right? So it's not so gray. All right, so we could tweak it that way. All right, and let's say we want to maybe darken these or tint these. Same thing, right? You notice these are going to be on the blue. Now the blue is interesting here, right? Because if I hit B on the keyboard, you'll notice that the blue also have the tires, all right? And they also have the headlights. So to isolate this is going to take a little bit more work with what we call a roto node, right? Which we'll talk about here in just a moment. So let's go ahead and we'll come back to doing that. If we want to do our rims, let's do our rims. So I'm just going to clone this node. So if we hold down Alt and hit K, that will create a clone. Now remember, if you're seeing a clone arrow, you can turn that off in your preferences. Again, this little C chip lets me know this is a clone. That's why I don't need the arrow. But I'll go ahead and create another grade node. And I'll do this down here at the bottom after everything's been kind of added together. And I'll go ahead and, let's see, the rims are on the green, so we'll say mask input. Let's use the green channel. And then we can take our gain and we can up those rims a little bit. Tweak them out just a little bit. Okay. So yeah, so let's go ahead and darken this area here. Okay, so what we can do for the blue, right, we need to isolate it with a roto. And a roto node is essentially how we draw shapes inside of Nuke. Okay, so I'm going to branch off a roto from here. So I'm going to create a point. I'm going to tab in a roto node. All right. Okay. Now, the way I'm going to draw this, right, we're going to output into our color. So I'll say output into RGB. And then I'm going to grab the Bezier. So just click and hold on the tool. And there's our Bezier. Now, we're going to use this tool a lot when we get into our roto. But for now, we're just going to draw our shape. So we're going to click and hold to pull out the handles and drag around that area that's just the windows. Just like that. Okay? And you'll notice that it fills the shape with white. But we need to adjust a few things on the shape to get this to look right. Okay, so again, there's our shape, and it doesn't need to look pretty. Okay, just remember, just click here, select your Bezier, and go ahead and start clicking around the car just to making sure that you get all the windows in. All right, so in the properties for the shape, let's make sure we invert the shape. So we're going to click this little invert button here in the shape. There's our shape we just created. Click invert. Okay, and then the color of the shape, we'll just set it to black. So in the color, this is the one next to that invert button. Double click and go ahead and drop the value to black. All right. So now if I hit B on the keyboard and look at just the blue channel, it's just the windows. Okay, so from here, move these down. And this is where the mask input wants to go for our next grade. Here's our next grade, our mask input. And for this one, right, we want it to be our blue channel, okay? So now if I drop the gain, you can see we can start to tint our windows down. And I just want to go ever so slightly, not too much here, right? Okay. All right, so we've got our car in, looks good. Now let's go ahead and start talking about, let's go ahead and finalize this and talk about doing our finalizing techniques, all right? So what we want to do now is essentially simulate the look of a camera. Now, again, obviously this was shot with a camera, okay, but we denoised it, right? And it did go through Photoshop and it was altered a little bit, although you still can see a little bit of the lens distortion. We did straighten it out. So we're going to add in a little bit of lens distortion back in, okay? These next few steps that we're doing here, it's for believability's sake, okay? This is just going to be general stuff that we do, but this is typical with composites, right? We want to incorporate these types of lens and camera artifacts to make or help sell the final result or sell the final image here, okay? So here, first thing I want to do is add in an overall color correction of the image, okay? And that's just to make sure that everything kind of lines up and looks good. So first thing I'm going to do is add in a color lookup. Now I really like the color lookup node. It's very similar to the curves tool inside of Photoshop. If you guys come from Photoshop, it's very similar. So I'm going to do a simple S-curve adjustment. Nothing too drastic here. I just want to give a little bit of contrast to the image. Okay, nothing too major here. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is a little bit of vignetting. Okay, vignetting is basically just darkening the areas of the image or brightening areas of the image that you want the audience to look at or focus on. And in fact, or at least that's how I'm going to use it in this case. Okay, so we're going to need to do this with another roto node. So I'm going to create another roto, In this case, I'll use the quick key. I'll hit O on the keyboard to create our roto. All right, and I'm going to draw, and this time I'm going to click and hold and create an ellipse. And just go ahead and draw this ellipse out, just like this. All right. Okay, so we'll create a grade node, G on the keyboard, so it's right after our initial color. Plug the mask input in it. In fact, I'll keep it over here. And go ahead and drop the gain down, and immediately you'll notice that looks wrong. Okay, so we want to darken the edges, right? We need to just invert this shape. So again, you could do it in the node, the roto node, invert it there, or you can just invert the mask and the grade node here, okay? And after this roto node, I'm going to create a blur, and we're going to blur these edges out. So create a blur and just blur it way out, okay? Now, this is way too dark, so let's back this up. You just want to drop it a little bit. It's just to slightly vignette the sides. Now, this is a little too large, so I'll scale it. Shift Option to scale from the center. I'll just scale it down and maybe focus it a little bit more like that, okay? Now, again, too dark, so we want to back off, maybe to around 0.7. Okay, the purpose is not to see the vignette. The purpose is to focus your eyes to the brightest part of the image. So you shouldn't see it unless I disable it. So if I disable it, there it is without it, and there it is with it, okay? So they're flipping it on and off, right? It's subtle, but right. You got to remember what we're trying to do here. And even that might be a little too extreme. I'll leave it, but again, it's a subtle technique, and it's just to draw your audience's eyes, at least in this case, how I'm using it, all right? So the next thing I want to create is basically the chromatic aberration effect. Now, if you guys, again, don't know what chromatic aberration is, again, use your book, or you can look online, and I do discuss it in our lecture videos. So make sure you're watching the lecture videos as well. But basically, chromatic aberration is when the lens fails to get the light kind of directed in the right way. So the results are artifacts left. And it's most noticeable towards the edges, or as you get towards the edges of the frame. So you'll see different types of chromatic aberration, red and blue, you'll see green and magenta. Okay, we'll do a green and magenta type of chromatic here. And the effect, again, is supposed to be subtle, so you don't want to be extreme with this. Now, there's multiple ways to create chromatic aberration in Nuke, and as we go throughout the month, I'll show you guys multiple ways. The way we're going to do it in this assignment is we're going to use what's called a transformed masked node. So I'm going to tab in a transformed masked, and make sure it's the one that says masked and not just a normal transform. And the reason why is because the masked gives you the option for the channels up here. So we want to affect only one channel here. So we're going to select RGB, but we're going to turn off green and blue. So that means we only use red here, all right? And what we're going to do is increase the scale. So if you notice, if I only increase the scale on the red channel, watch what happens to the image. All right, see how you start to get that effect? Okay, but again, this is supposed to be very, very subtle, so you don't want to go too far with it. You don't, again, necessarily want to see it. So I'm going to go up here. This statue tends to be a good gauge on how close I'm getting here. So you can see how I'm dialing these values in. Okay, something like that. Again, very subtle here. And you should notice it as we get farther away from the frame. So if I disable it, that's without it, and that's with it. All right. Again, it's these basic techniques to help sell the realism. Okay, so we've got our chromatic. Now let's add in a bit of lens distortion. And again, we're doing this just for believability's sake, for taste. Okay, so we're going to create the lens distortion node. And you'll notice the lens distortion node, there's a lot of stuff you can use. Okay, there's a lot of different things you can do in this node. And we're not going to use all of it for that. All we're going to do is go to our output and set for redistort. And in the denominators, we can, again, tweak these settings and start to kind of bend the image to simulate the look of film. Now that's way too much. The look of a lens. That's way too much, by the way. So you don't want to do that much. You want to be very subtle with this. Yeah, see, that's way. So let's back that down. if you're having issues with it doing that. See how it's scrolling as I'm wanting to use my scroll wheel? I just disconnect the node so it doesn't do that. There we go. Subtle, guys. Don't add too much of this in. Maybe something like that. Again, disable it and re-enable it. Yeah, that's still a little too much for me. So I'm going to come back in here. Oh, it's doing that scrolling thing. Disconnect it. Okay, that should be okay. All right, just again, like I said, we're just adding in our finalizing effects, and then the last thing we're going to do is put in our grain. That's usually the last stage, right? Because the light hits the sensor of the film, so that's where the grain's going to come in. And typically you might have grain stock or film stock that you'll need to match. Again, we're just going to add this in for believability. So we'll create our grain node, and by default it's going to be way too extreme. First thing you need to do in the grain node is make sure you uncheck apply only through alpha. You'll notice, whoa, way too much here, okay? So let's drop the intensities down, okay? So we're all at 0.4, 0.4, and there's usually more in the blue, so you'll want to keep the blue higher, but I'm going to bring the intensity way down in these guys. So we're getting something that looks a little bit more like that. Again, if you disable it and then enable it, okay. I think that's looking good. For this assignment, I think this will be fine. All right, so we'll go ahead and backdrop this. So tab in a backdrop, and we'll finalize. Call this finalize. All right, and let's go ahead and render it out. All right, so once you've gotten to this point, make sure you guys are using your backdrops. Let me go ahead and name this car. And you're staying organized in your scripts, okay? And you've gotten this far and you've used your IDs. At least once use your IDs for me. Go ahead and render it out. Make sure you're doing your finalizing. So this is how we render, all right? You guys are going to create a write node. So you read to import. To write, you export. So here's a write node, okay? Now, if you want to see a little postage stamp of what you're going to write out, you can highlight a node and hit Option P or Alt P if you're on a Windows machine, and that'll show you a little postage stamp of what's passing through the node. And you can do that with any node. It's not just a write node. So this node, Option P, see how you can kind of see what passes through it. Or if you want to know what's passing through this node, Option P. There you go. All right. So anyway, let's talk about how the write node works. All right. Basically, what you want to do with the write node is just start at the top and work your way down. So the first thing you want to do is, what do I want to render out? Well, I want to render out my color channels, right? Obviously there's my composite, so I'm going to go ahead and render it out the RGB. The next thing it needs to know is, where do you want to render it? All right, so in this case I want to render it to that folder, so I'm going to go to my desktop, basic comp, okay, and I'm going to name it the naming of the script, right? So this will be this. Let me double check and make sure we're naming it like I have it on FSO. So we go to FSO here. It is intro.jpg. Okay. So it will be this month number and then underscore intro. And you need to make sure that you put the extension. Since we're rendering a JPEG, you need to make sure you type in JPG. Okay. And the reason why is the write node needs to know the extension of the file type. Therefore, it can give you the options for that file type. So now that it knows that it's a JPEG, it gives me the quality options for the JPEG. So we're going to set the quality slider to 1. And then we're going to go ahead and render And since it's only one frame, let's just go ahead and render one frame. So go ahead and hit OK. All right, it should have rendered. I'll go ahead and save my comp. And let's look and see. There it is in that folder. There is my render. Okay, so just to go over the project, what we talked about, remember at the beginning we talked about making sure that you set your project, save your script, use the little project expression directories so you can keep the paths. We talked about how we created the background in the sky and put those together, how we created the light wrap to incorporate the background with the sky, how we talked about the different render passes that the cars that we rendered out of Maya and how we comped them together for the control of the composite, basically using the IDs to isolate areas of the car so we can further color correction, right? How we added the shadows to the background and whatnot. How we did our final color correction and then rendered out the image, okay? So we did a lot of little things in this particular assignment, okay? We also played with a little bit of roto, although we'll get into a lot more of that in our later assignments. So as far as this assignment, that's all you need to submit, and then you can go ahead and move on to your next one. So if you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me or email me, and I'll get back in touch with you as soon as I can. All right, thanks guys.